Hello, everybody. Hi, welcome. It's Carolyn Ducey here at the International Quilt Museum. Look at me. I'm scrambling today. We've had a big weekend, and my brain is not where it should be. It's so great to have you all here. We're going to have a really exciting time talking about one of my favorite types of quilts, Chintz applique, and all of the variations that Sandra is going to show us. But before we get started with Sandra and I introduce her, I just want to remind everybody that seminar is coming up. The AQSG seminar is coming up here, and the registration deadline is just a couple weeks away. So I really encourage you to sign up. The keynote speaker, Dr. Myra Brown Green, is a renowned author and quilt maker, and I think you're going to really love her presentation. And we have one of our own, Janniken Smucker, who is going to be one of the luncheon speakers. And Janniken was a graduate of our program here in Lincoln and worked with us to do an amazing exhibition, A New Deal for Quilts. Her book just won an amazing award. So Janniken has so much great information to share with you during the seminar. So don't miss that deadline. So today I'm really excited to introduce our speaker, Sandra Starley. Sandra is a nationally certified quilt appraiser, historian, researcher, collector, lecturer, designer, and instructor. She maintains an extensive collection of both antique quilts and research materials, and is active in the American Quilt Study Group and the Quilt Alliance. She presents trunk shows on quilt history and dating and antique quilts as material culture. She enjoys reproducing quilts from her collection, especially in small scale. She's won national awards for both her antique reproductions and has been part of several traveling exhibits and has quilts featured in national quilt magazines and several historical quilt books. So welcome, Sandra, to the Quiltside Chats. You picked out more than just one quilt that you take home if you had the chance, didn't you?
Of course.
We do have
in my other life, I'm a criminal defense attorney. So if you're going to do the...
I'm sorry. Go ahead, Sandra. Oh. We may have had Sandra freeze. We're going to be looking today at a variety of Chintz applique quilts from the International Quilt Museum collection, and as well as Sandra's collection. So we're doing a little bit of a different format today. So Sandra, are you back with us now? We had a little glitch there, I think, in the connection.
Yeah.
Yeah, here you are. So anyway, it's going to just be fun. I was just telling Molly, who's behind the scenes and helping us run things today, that it's been about 13 years since I did my dissertation research on some Chintz applique quilts that were in the area we're talking about today. And gosh, it's been fun to go back to that and think about those quilts again, because I really haven't gotten back to that research. So I'm really looking forward to what you're going to be able to update us on, Sandra.
Thank you.
So how long have you been studying these quilts?
Since 2005, I've been studying signature quilts in the area. And then in the New Jersey side since 2017.
Great. Some really rich research. Well, shall we get started with your PowerPoint?
Okay.
Well, you go right ahead, Sandra, and I might jump in with a few questions.
Okay, the next slide. So this is the Reese quilt, and if you want to really do more research or get more information about this, Xenia Cord did the Quiltside Chat number 9 and did a really deep dive into this quilt. She's really familiar with it.
Yes.
So it was made by the ladies of the Evangelical Sewing Circle of the First Baptist Church in Philadelphia. And it was made for Anne Reese, and she was a very, from a very prominent family. And I love learning history through quilts. And so I love that the key to her house, the Locksley house, was borrowed by Benjamin Franklin in his experiment with lightning. So it's just amazing, all the little things you can learn. But my favorite thing about this is the next slide, the dedication. So next slide.
Don't you love when they tell you why a quilt was made and by who? That's so great to have that.
Those are my favorite things. So this one is the only quilt I've seen with the phrasing of that it's presented by the ladies of the sewing circle and quote, and other attached relatives and friends. And that really got me thinking about album quilts, signature quilts, that they've really attached those people to the quilted textile, quilted document. And I just love that phrasing of attaching your friends to you. And then there's a lot of text, obviously, 7 verses. But the highlights are, we bring a simple gift of love, and then that's how it starts. And then it finishes, accept our gift. Familiar names are traced upon its ample page, and every friend some notice claims, and would some transient thought engage. Just the sentiment is just so touching. Next slide.
And it tells us about so many other quilts too, that this was something that was common for not only your church group, but your family and friends to come together on a project.
Yeah, so that's kind of why I've entitled this topic Family, Faith, and Friends, because it really is that whole community, and it's making a physical document of that love. So here's a block from Mary Jackson, Anne's daughter, and you can see the detail on the left. There's 2 little ships and all sorts of beautiful inking. That's one of the other things I really love about these quilts is they tend to not just be a name. There's so much other information that they impart. So this one's is a Baptist family. Okay, next slide. And this is the fish quilt. And this one is, there's only 2, I think, in this presentation from the museum collection that I've seen in the cloth. This one I have seen, and it's stunning.
Yes, it's gorgeous.
I mean, who could not steal this one?
You and me both, Sandra.
I know. I figured you'd help me get it out. Beautiful eagle center medallion to the fringed border on 3 sides. I mean, it's just breathtaking. And a lot of beautiful, beautiful chintz applique. And so this is one also that Carolyn studied in her dissertation. And this one is from New Jersey. And then there's 2 other companion quilts that were made by this Fish family. So I will put in the YouTube page, I will put links or the resources list. But one of the resources, if you're interested in this topic, is looking at Carolyn's dissertation, Chintz Applique Albums, Memory and Meaning. And she focused on these quilts from the Delaware River Valley.
Yeah, and I see Terry mentioned that the slides seem to be a little bit out of focus. Hopefully we can get that straightened out. That might be a connectivity problem. We seem to have some lapses today we don't typically have. On my computer, it looks okay, so I hope it will resolve. Molly's behind the scene. I'm sure she's checking to see if there's anything she can do on her end too, but we apologize if we are a little out of focus today.
Oh, and that reminds me, if people do have questions, we can try to answer them.
Yes, absolutely. You can chat with us as we go along, and I'll help with those questions. So you'll see that on the right of your screen where you can add any comments or questions.
Perfect. Okay, next slide. So here's the detail of the center, and it lists the and her husband. And this one is the Reese quilt was from 1846, and this quilt is from 1843.
And Sandra, you glitched on my end just for a second when you mentioned who made this quilt.
Emmeline Fish is who it's dedicated to.
Great, thank you.
And it was her family, correct?
Yes.
That made the 3 quilts.
Yes. We think that they might have been made together and under the tutelage of her aunt, is what we kind of supposed after looking at all the quilts.
And it seems like Philadelphia gets all the credit, and it's probably because they're bigger. But this one was made in Trenton, and then a lot of the other ones were made outside of Philadelphia in Chester County or outside of Trenton in Burlington County. So a lot of them were the more rural areas, although they probably had to go to the bigger areas to get their fabric. Next, please. So here's a detail of just some of the beautiful fabrics. And then next. Okay, so here is the Ridgway Shin quilt, and it's from Burlington County, 1842 to 43. And you can see it has the same general format as the fish quilt. And it shares several fabrics. Next. So here's just 2 of the fabrics that are shared. The basket on the left frames the eagle in the fish quilt. And then the other flower block is used several times also. So I think the basket is at least 4 times used in the fish quilt.
And Sandra, do you typically see that these are handwritten inscription? Do you see stamps? How are they doing all of these names and all the different inscriptions?
Good question. Because that reminds me, one comment I was going to make is we call them signature quilts, but often it would be more technically correct to call them name inscribed quilts, because sometimes they're stamped, sometimes they're stenciled, sometimes they're cross stitch or other embroidery. Mm-hmm. Sometimes that they aren't actually done by the maker. They aren't autographs, they're allographs, because they're done by someone else, either because they are a dedication block, a memorial block, or you'll see on this Ridgway quilt, there's a block that says Daniel Ridgway, our babe, 1844, and he's a baby. So he obviously did not make the block, nor did he sign it.
That's an important point. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. And there are a lot of them where, I mean, even if there isn't an indication that the person has passed, you definitely cannot assume that somebody whose name you see is old enough to sign or is living at the time. Sometimes they will indicate that the person is deceased, but they may not. So I think that's something that catches people off guard, to realize that it looks like somebody signed it, but they're not living. And that can get you off on the wrong track. So here is the center block with a beautiful thistle and rose. So very English, Great Britain tribute. But the quote, the poem written in the center is, "From Moses down to Washington, among the sons of men, a greater man was never found than Quaker William Penn." Marie M. Ridgway, March 1844. So don't really have to guess whether this is a Quaker family. She really put her Quaker values right there. But I mean, everybody did really seem to love William Penn. There's toiles and paintings and everything of William Penn and him working his land treaties with the indigenous population. And speaking of which, next slide. Here's yeah, this is Rebecca Scattergood Savory block, and it has Rebecca Savery, aged 74, and that's on her 6-star album quilt that's in the museum collection. Probably one of, I would bet, one of the favorites of the Jameses.
You know, they're spectacular. They just truly are. And isn't it interesting that that is the design she chose for her block? She really must have admired Penn and his work.
Yes.
She's making a statement.
Yes. And she definitely was Quaker. We're not just assuming that because of this, but, and was such a prolific quilt maker. I mean, there's 6 quilts at least in museums that are known.
Yeah, 6 or 7, but they are also such intricate pieces and so beautifully created. So she was prolific.
2 blocks, yeah, and 2 blocks recently surfaced that are still with the family. And one had Rebecca Savery, age 74. So looks like there was part of another quilt she was working on.
Wow.
Next slide. So this is the full quilt, and it is just beautiful. And you can see.
If you like chintz, if you like beautiful early fabrics, these are some of the most fine calico prints and ombres that I think I've ever seen.
And it's fussy cut, selectively cut. It's just a real triumph. And if that weren't good enough, then next slide. Then look at this one that the museum has. Another quilt that the Jameses purchased. So this one kind of combines the 2 elements of the quilts that she made. Some of the quilts that are in museums are just a starburst. Like that's the center. And then some are the album. So this one, she kind of made a mix, a really nice combination of those 2 elements that she really enjoyed. And so who knows how many, that's one of the things that is always amazing is how many quilts are still out there that we don't know about, that are still with the family that nobody's heard of. The quilt behind me was with the family until 2017 when they contacted Kathy Cray and she got it to me. But it's just, and like I said, those 2 blocks that Rebecca and her sister Elizabeth made that were just on the market. There are treasures out there. So we all have to really keep our eyes open and try to make connections between the things that we know about and be ready to be surprised about what else is out there. Next slide.
It's exciting.
Yes. And this block is from the Shin quilt, Ridgway Shin quilt also. And it's the framing of the 4 of the center blocks. And this is, who knows what we should call this block. I usually call it like the weird leaf heart block. It was really popular with this small group of women in Burlington County, New Jersey. And it's on the Harriet Shin quilts. It's on, obviously, mine. It's on several different quilts. Some are album quilts, some are not. Lisa Erlandson has a sampler that doesn't have any names, but it has this block. There's at the very beginning of the New Jersey Quilt Book, there's a quilt that's made just of this block. And I still haven't found any connection between that and these quilts, but so there's always so much more research. But Barbara Brackman wrote about this one a couple of years ago, and that's how I found one of the other quilts in my research group that's in the Landis Museum in Pennsylvania.
Sandra, is this would this be the Sharon Schnitte where they're folding and cutting this design, do you think?
I think so.
It has
because
that balance.
They're really symmetrical, yeah.
Yeah.
And some have more flourishes, but they're all generally about like this. It also reminds me of, Little Shop of Horrors with the Seymour plant. It's not your standard applique. Plus,
that's a hard applique pattern.
Yeah, it's a hard design. So it wouldn't have been my first choice. And then to do that, the reverse for the signature area and then the reverse applique for the little heart. Yeah. So this, I don't know if you can zoom in, Molly, on the signature, but this one is signed by Lucy B. Ridgway. And she's one of my favorite signature people because she's always really good about putting her full name and her town and the date. And she's signed several quilts in the group that I'm studying from Burlington County. And if you want more information, I'll put a link also to the uncoverings paper that Joyce Smith did on her Harriet Shin quilt and their relatives. But you've got to love the people that add all that detail instead of just like signing Lucy. And she also did that on some of her other quilts. So Judy Schwender asked if the section where the inscription is applique or a cutout. It's a reverse applique.
So that's the background of the quilt showing through.
Right. Correct.
Well, that is so great that she offers all that information. As a historian, you got to just appreciate that so much.
Yes, I love that. And the Shin family was really good about that too. Harriet, and this is her brother, George Shin. And so below the bird, he's added Pleasant Hill, which isn't a town, it's their homestead that by New Egypt, New Jersey. And the Quakers had kind of a interesting thing about naming their homes. Sort of if you think about the Southern Plantation and Tara, they kind of did the same thing and added names to their homes. So next slide. You can see that Harriet also did that. So it says Harriet M for Miller, her mother's maiden name. Harriet Miller Shin, Pleasant Hill, 1843. And so Harriet, like Lucy, is always really good about putting all that information. And that was probably one of the things that got me really interested in signature quilts is when I was starting to learn about quilt history and appraising, I figured out quite early on that these quilts with names and places and dates are the perfect venue or tool to help learn quilt dating because you've got all that information right there. So you know that fabric was extant in 1843. You knew this technique was around during that time. So they're really an invaluable tool. So that was why I started collecting them and really started focusing on them. Next slide. So here is Harriet's cousin, first cousin, Agnes Shin from New Jersey. And it's dated 1846. And this one, if you really look closely, you can see that it's actually done in a medallion setting. So if you kind of squint and follow out from the center.
Yeah, those paint blocks are kind of the corner of that medallion.
Mm-hmm. And again, they're on all of these quilts from the museum collection. You can find more in Quilts of the Industrial Age, the Carolyn's amazing book.
I was just an editor, but you know who did the amazing research on the piece blocks was Agnes Fish. And what I found fascinating is that I had looked at this quilt many times and I did not recognize that it was in a medallion format. And Janice mapped out those quilts. And
I would never have noticed that.
Yeah. And so her chapter in that volume is really incredible. And I felt like she did some really groundbreaking research in that area.
And another interesting thing that she noticed that I don't think I would have ever noticed was that she only had to add a border on the left side and the bottom side. So look really closely. On the top and the right side, the delectable sawtooth variation, delectable mountain variation, fills in the sawtooth
I see.
the top and the right. And then she only had to add the sawtooth border on two sides, which is
I didn't see it for a minute, but isn't that an intriguing way of balancing that out that really pulls your eye?
Because anything else would not have worked it just would not have worked as well. It would have either made a double on the top and the right, or it would have made the left and the bottom kind of drop off. So yeah, the balance of adding those two borders to just two sides is perfection.
It is. Wow.
And so the reason why this one is included in this discussion is because it's related to the quilt behind me and the Shin Ridgeway quilt. And then also because it's Harriet's aunt or cousin. This one's her cousin. But because Agnes thoughtfully labeled her quilt with both her name and date, and then a dedication to her daughter when she passed to her daughter about 50 years later, it's become a family record. So that's my plug for remembering to always label your quilts, because it can make your quilt a part of history and share that. Again, you've got the quilted document.
I'm going to remember how you said that, Sandra, because I'm always talking about labeling, and I like that. It makes it a part of history. It truly does.
Yeah. Next.
Nice.
And so here you can see some of the fabrics she used, and she did really pretty floral motif quilting in the alternate or the other side of the blocks, the plain background fabric. I thought that was really different. Most of these signature album quilts don't have very intricate.
We kind of lost you there again, Sandra. You were saying that
be done probably on a deadline for.
Yeah, we're just having a little trouble with connection, but
so,
you were saying that
so they generally don't have very elaborate. So this one has more elaborate quilting, but again, it isn't a signature album quilt. The signature album quilts do tend to have minimal quilting, probably because they were made, as a group project to give to somebody that was retiring or moving or getting married or something special. So, and plus the relationships, the sharing, the love, the fabrics even were the focus, and quilting just wasn't really the focus of most of these quilts. Next.
Yeah.
And here's okay. So this is the quilt that's behind me, the 1843 Rogers, Hartshorn, Kirby are the main names. And it's from all around Fort Dix, New Jersey, where I lived when I was a teenager. So outside of Philadelphia, outside of Cherry Hill, New Jersey, Burlington County, New Jersey. And there are place names from all around that general area. And you can see that it's a sampler, a real mix of cutwork, applique. There's the Disso cactus that Terry Terrell wrote about and that she discussed in her Quiltside chat. And there's birds and flowers, and then there's intricate pieced blocks and
Wow.
just a real mix. Next. And this block is Rachel Shin Kirby, and she is the aunt of Agnes Shin.
Wow.
Shin. So the previous quilt maker, this is her aunt. So there's just all sorts of connections between these quilts. And so you can see she did a pieced block. So the real mix. Next. And this one is from Elizabeth Poinsett for 1842. And I just love the creativity that these ladies used. They would mix and match from several different Chintz fabrics to create their own unique appliques. They take like a bird from one quilt and put them, or one fabric and put them on another fabric, or take a flower from one fabric and add it to another. Or they were definitely not just using the cutting it out as printed. Next. Now this is the outlier quilt in a number of ways. It's from Hepzibah Shin Cox, and she was born in New Jersey, but at this time she was living in Ohio, and this was made much later in 1857, 1858.
And some of these chintzes are very, very different in this era, aren't they?
The Chintz application.
I think, Sandra, we're getting a little like freeze in the video as you're speaking, and then we get you back. So it's a little bit, we're kind of going back and forth here. Yeah, unfortunately, we're not hearing Sandra very well. And I don't know if that's just on my computer or if other people are having that problem too. We'll see if we can get Sandra back here in a minute. No, looks like we may have lost Sandra. Well, Sandra, I'm sure is going to hop right back on. She'll join us in a second. For those of you who are out there that are studying chintz or know anything about it, I always thought that it was a fascinating this quilt was evidence of a real change in the kind of chintz fabric that was being used. Obviously, this is 10 or 14 years later when it was finished than the typical mid-1840s quilts. And you really see a drop off in many of these chintzes of the fine detailing and the additional colors that are used in it. So fewer colors, which would make it cheaper to print. But I often wonder if, because these fabrics changed, if that's one of the reasons why chintz quilts fell out of favor. Sandra, you're back. So
Hi.
I'm glad. So start over at the beginning with this quilt, if you would, because we kind of lost you before you weren't on screen. We couldn't really hear your explanation of it.
Okay. So this one is an outlier quilt in several ways. It's from Ohio and not from the Delaware River Valley. And it's also much later than you generally see chintz quilts. It was made in 1857, 1858. So it's attributed to Hepzibah Shin Cox, and she's Harriet Shin's aunt. So the lady that we looked at her signature. And she's also the aunt of Agnes Burtis, who did the Delectable Mountains quilt. And so I think she was influenced by the family quilts, by the Harriet's made two quilts that look very much like the one behind me. So I can see that could have influenced Hepzibah to make this quilt at a later date. I think she was also in her 70s. So the phenomenon of chintz applique and signature name inscribed album quilts really started. There's a couple with at least one date of 1839, and then rest had 1840 for two quilts that have been found. And then by like 42, 43, there's just oodles of them around. So it just really took off like gangbusters in the early 1840s. And we don't really know why, other than I think it was an acceptable thing for women who suddenly had a lot more leisure time. That it was also related to maybe gathering signatures like in autograph albums. They had access to fabric, that time aspect. This was generally a wealthy woman's pastime. This was not mill workers. This was not farm hands. You know, this was the leisure class, the more wealthy. But so I think Hepzibah was probably influenced by the family tradition of these quilts. But yeah, as Carolyn mentioned, this is when chintz started getting not as nice, and when you started to hear the chintzy as a negative.
You do wonder if that's what, when that meaning of chintzy was really established, because the fabrics really do have such a lower quality look to them.
Yes, and
not all of these, but
right.
Some of the details I know you're going to show really indicate and really have a simple look to them in essence compared to the detailed look of other chintzes.
Well, and they may have been using, you know, older fabrics that they still had, and then the newer ones that weren't as high quality. It may be bold. But you'll notice too that on the three corners, there's a red and green applique. So that's similar to the mix of motifs in the quilt behind me also. Next.
Yeah, these are fun blocks, aren't they? They're so different.
On the left is a ram, and it says, "Hurrah, Old Buck, 1857." And so that was to honor or show support of President Buchanan, whose term started in 1857. And we'll talk about showing political allegiances some more later on. And I love the girls on the swing. It's such a odd combat. Speaking of people taking bits and pieces of different chintzes and combining them. Obviously, nobody printed a chintz like this with a funny dahlia rose something. Terry could tell us what it's supposed to be, but it's a real fanciful creation.
Yeah, that scale is a little off, isn't it?
Yeah, just a titch. Next, please. Okay, now we're to the one that I really would steal for sure. And I saw this one is probably about,
yeah, this is a spectacular quilt.
This is the Sarah Wister quilt from 1842, Philadelphia. And one of the things, it's a beautiful quilt. There's beautiful fabric. It's really well composed. You'll see the centers and then those framing stars out from the center, very balanced. But one of the things that is most striking about it is such a historical document, both a family history document and then just general history. And if anybody has been to Philadelphia to the Arch Street Meeting House, Quaker Meeting House, they have a quilt that's related to this that is very similar, same time period and some of the same people. Okay, next. So here's a couple of blocks where you can see some of the selective cutting. That 8-pointed star is just fabulously cut out. And then the block on the right was probably English paper pieced to get those beautiful curves. Just such attention to detail. And this one again is tribute to Sarah, of love from her family and her friends and the people that she worked with at several Quaker service organizations. So that alone would make it fabulous if it just had those signatures and that information. But next slide is the real kicker. So this is literally a family tree, and it starts with Caspar Wister leaving Germany. And so it goes back to, obviously, right there, the roots of the family, literally, and covering about 150 years, about 1696 to 1840. So
it's hard to imagine
such a detailed thing.
Yes, I was going to say, how do you even draw that on fabric? I mean, I know they had means, but imagine how difficult it is to just put your autograph on a quilt, and then you have this beautiful quilt with this detail, or this beautiful tree with such detail.
And with so many different places where you could mess up.
Yes.
I mean, you're writing a lot of information down there. So I would imagine they probably had it all sketched out. But I just love this transference of, what you would have in the old family Bibles where you'd have all the genealogy. But they've made it into a textile and a soft, comforting history. It's just amazing. Terry asked,
Terry has a comment. You see Terry's comment there that the critics suggesting realistic flowers was false design, so suggesting something realistic. You know, I think Terry's done some groundbreaking research, so she may be exactly right, because I think my research is a decade old, and I think she's done a lot more on chintz. So I don't think we really know why the chintzes would have changed, but I think that maybe just the fact that they weren't as, whether the reasoning for the design changed or not, I just think the look of the fabric just wasn't as appealing. And I wonder if that was just part of the reason why, one of the reasons why the chintz style kind of fell out of favor, because women followed fashion, they followed trends. We've seen that over and over again in these regional styles, that women liked what their neighbors or their friends were making or their family, and they kind of did the same thing. And so if they didn't love the fabric, maybe that was one of the reasons why this style went out of favor. It's just one of my ideas. Kathy, we don't believe this is a printed panel. I think this is a hand-done panel because of all the names.
Wyndham did do a reproduction of all of these fabrics, and they did a panel of the whole quilt. Oh, no, that's the Pennock. That's the Pennock one. Yeah, no, this is definitely inked.
Yeah.
And I've noticed that with a lot of the signatures, they look like they're all about the same. You can see ones like with the pair of lovebirds at a fountain, and you'll see that motif several times, but they're all slightly different. And people may have copied a design they saw on a friend's, but we have not, I think if any of figural inkings were actually from stamps, we would have found a stamp by now. Still,
I think they could have been a combination of maybe some basic forms, or you know what I think it also could have been, Sandra, is that maybe they were going to a professional for some of those really elaborate designs, and that professional would have been one who could have repeated that fairly closely. But maybe not always the individuals who made the quilts or were having them signed. Maybe they used an artist or someone who was a calligrapher of sorts.
Right, or a paid scrivener, like you'll see with the Rolling Stone quilts from just north of.
Yeah, I think this was a skill. I don't think every average maker would have been able to ink beautifully on their quilt, and we see that in a lot of the simpler signatures where they were blotchy and they had trouble with it. So when you see these really, really finely done ones, you somebody had to be really good, and maybe it was just a member of the family who had developed a real skill and was the one who did this kind of work. We don't know that, but it was not just your average person picking up that instrument to ink those pieces.
Well, what Lena found a paper that showed the skill, the little drawings that were given out at probably a ladies' school, and from this time period. So there were definitely some of those skills being taught at like the finishing boarding schools that some of the wealthier young women were going to. Leah asks, is it possible that the growth of American manufacturing, the ability to print smaller designs and less complicated chintzes, became the thing to do as the result of economics? One of the things I'm researching is the fabrics of these quilts in New Jersey, in Burlington County specifically, how they are related to the family that had a fabric factory at this time. And so it may be something to do with that American manufacturing.
Yeah, so I had kind of supposed that maybe it was the kind of transition from English manufacturers who were really accomplished to American. But I also do think economics always plays a role in these changes that we see. And technology is such a huge driver of what we see in quilts. Sandra, I hate to do this, but I have to run. We only have about 8 minutes left. I just checked.
Okay.
I've been so enthralled with our conversation. So you're just going to have to hit the high points now, I'm afraid.
Okay, next slide. So this block is a dedication to William Henry Harrison, and showing the support of the Whig Party with the log cabin. Next slide. So it has William Henry Harrison, president, and he was only president for 30 days or 32 days. He was the one that gave the speech in the bad weather and died after. So
Right.
with the caption, "Man proposes, God disposes."
Yeah,
So
and look at
next
that
slide.
design. That house is probably a half-inch tall.
It's
Somebody had
just
great skill.
And so this is a cousin quilt in the Chester County Museum, the Chintz Album quilt. And it has a lot of similarities. Next slide. Here's a family genealogy book, this time, not as epic as Casper's Family Tree, but very similar. And then similarly, next slide, is this intricate English paper piece block. And the center is the log cabin. And it also has the hard cider barrel. And so the barrel says hard cider. And it seems kind of odd for Quaker, but I know that it was the symbol of the Whig Party, the log cabin party. So just interesting what you'll find, these little clues as to their religious background, their political affiliations. You just have to look closely. And a lot of these things are that if you don't know the history, you would just totally pass them by. You just think, oh, they're doing a little inking of a log cabin. Next. And this quilt is a block, also has the log cabin, and the pennant says Henry Clay, 1844. So again, showing the log cabin and support for the Whig Party. Next. And here's Kathy's quilt. And then on the right, you can see it with my signature album quilt. Next. And this is Enoch and Mary Worrell's quilt from 1850 from Chester County, Pennsylvania. And this one is also a genealogy document. And the blocks on the bottom left and right were leftovers from a quilt that was started in the 1840s for their daughter, Mary Worrell. And they were finishing up both quilts in 1850. So they had those two blocks left over. Next. And this was the quilt that really started my interest in signature quilts. So the center says Enoch and Mary Worrell quilt. So we're leaving no data as to whose quilt this is. Then diagonally on the right, it says Enoch and Mary Worrell's children. Again, we're not leaving any doubt. And so around the star points are the names of all their children, both living and deceased. And if they are deceased, then that's noted. And then the children that were still living at the time had their own blocks on the quilt. If you can go back, just back one, Molly. One of the things that's really fun about this quilt is it's also a red, white, and green quilt, literally, because there are white surnames, scarlet surnames, and green surnames.
Oh my gosh.
And so it's Quaker family and friends. And several of the blocks are documenting the genealogy. And so there'll be the wife and her current husband and the brother that was her first husband that's deceased. So again, a genealogical document. Next. And this finally is one of the blocks left over from the daughter's quilt. And it has the inscriptions, and then it has a poem. Friendship is the joy. Friendship is the joy of reason, dearer far than that of love. And the Quakers were the society of friends, so they were extolling the power of friendship. And then finally, last slide. This is my quilt in the center next to two, obviously, cousin quilts that had not been together for like 170 years.
Oh, wow.
I found out that they were hanging and I was going to be in Chester County at that time. So I carried my quilt on my lap across the country to reunite these quilts.
Wonderful.
So you never know what is out there and what you can still find.
No.
Connections you can still make.
There's a lot of great research that can still be done on these pieces, and more information. And Kristen asked about the type of ink, and I don't know that we really have information about what type of ink, because there are a number of different types. On some inscribed quilts we have in the museum, the ink ages very differently. So they were probably using different recipes and different types of inks on the quilt. It's kind of impossible to do the testing we'd need to do to know if it was the same or not, because that would be a destructive test. So,
right.
Oh my gosh, Sandra, it's 2:59. We're at the top of the hour already. Please do, there you've got Sandra's email. Please do get in touch with Sandra if you have questions. If you want to go and see more of these types of quilts on the International Quilt Museum website, you can go to our searchable database. And I would say search maybe by Chintz Applique or Album, or even a date range in the 1840s. As Sandra mentioned, the bulk of these pieces are made in the 1840s. So that would be a way to find them too. And gosh, I wish we had more time, Sandra, because there's just so much more fascinating information to delve into. But I know you've got it, and you can, and we're all working and sharing our research and trying to find out more about these families and find more of these quilts that are just integrally, they are just all related.
Right.
Thank you so much, Sandra, for sharing so much about these quilts, and really some spectacular, spectacular pieces.
Thank you.
I'm sorry we have to cut this off, everybody. It's too much.
Thanks, Molly.
Again, I'm sorry, Sandra, go ahead.
I was just thanking Molly too.
Yes, thank you, Molly. We always appreciate you behind the scenes, making us look good out here and making everything run so smoothly. Everybody, make sure you get your registration for seminar in. You're going to be in the heart of this country. Maybe you're going to go somewhere while you're visiting and there for seminar and find another quilt that relates. It can happen. I've seen it happen. And in the meantime, if you have a signature quilt of any type or an inscribed piece, let Sandra know. We've got to find a way to kind of bring all these together, because that's how that research is really going to grow.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sandra. And we will look forward to seeing everybody at our next Quiltside chat. It'll be coming up later this year. We're doing them quarterly, so we'll see you in a couple months and maybe see you at seminar. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.